Hi, my name's Alexander Shulan. It's June 26th, and I'm here to tell my story of what happened on 9/11. On September 11th, it was just a normal school day for me, so I woke up at 8 o'clock and got to school by 8:20. And we just started out the day, and we just met in homeroom for the first 10 minutes where we just met with our teacher, discussed what we were going to do that day. And then after that, I went to my first class, which was English class. And in English, I remember we were sitting down, and about the middle of the class, someone looked out the window, and we all turned our heads, and there was this plane going down, and it was going right, sort of straight down, slanting, and we were all wondering what it was, and we just all thought it must be just be a normal plane going out of route. And then someone in my class, as a joke, which we realized was quite cynical and rather disturbing later, said, "Oh, they're bombing us," and no one laughed because we didn't think it was a very funny joke, but later on it meant more than we actually realized. And we heard, I go to school on 4th Avenue and 11th Street, and we heard this noise, but no one thought anything of it because it wasn't that loud, and we continued with our class, and everyone was stood up and was trying to wonder what was going on. And the teacher just said, "Sit down, everything's fine, there's no problem." So I remember we were writing in our journals that day on a book we just finished reading, and it was so we continued on, and the windows in my English class look to the west, so we couldn't see the towers from there. And I remember after English class finished, we went to homeroom, and the windows look out on Broadway, but no one was paying any attention to the windows because the blinds were down. And during homeroom, we met with our teacher, and we were just having fun. We were eating watermelon and just having an overall good time. And after 20 minutes, we went to my math class, and the windows during math class look out on Broadway. And suddenly, someone looked out the window and said, "What is going on?" And we looked down the street, and there were hundreds of people walking up the street covered in dust from head to toe, with gas masks on, or dust masks. And we were all wondering what's going on, and people started to freak out, and because no one had any idea what was happening. And my teacher asked for us just to calm down and sit back to our desk, and we'll find out what's going on soon, and the principal will tell us. And so we just sat there and just trying to figure out what was going on. And my school has been around for a long time, and they have a bomb shelter, or at least they used to. They don't anymore, but there's still signs all over our floor, which is on the 5th floor, for the bomb shelter. And so people started to freak out and started trying to find the bomb shelter because they thought that part of the city had been hit with some sort of attack, or that downtown New York had been bombed or something. And people in my class, no one had any clue what was going on. And soon my math teacher got a phone call through the PA system, and it said for everyone to go down to the lunchroom, and for all the teachers, and they said it was not a fire drill. And it was extremely important. So the entire school went down onto the 2nd floor in the lunchroom, and my headmaster came out, and he came out and said that a plane had hit the World Trade Center, and we were sitting there, and everyone was just like, "Oh my God!" And he said that it was not, and that another plane had just hit it, and that it was not an accident, and it was a terrorist attack. And the U.S. government was not quite sure yet who had committed the attack, and that for everyone to stay calm, but just be aware that this is a great tragedy. And one of the really horrible things about that day was a lot of the people who go to my school, their parents work in the World Trade Center, and the school is on 4th Avenue, 11th Street, so it's convenient for the parents to have their kids go to that school because they can come pick them up on their way back from work. And what happened was, when the announcement was made, the entire school, just there was complete silence for like 4 minutes, and then the silence was broken by there was this girl in 6th grade, and her mother it was her father. He worked in the World Trade Center, and she just started crying uncontrollably, and then it just was like a wave of sobs, and about 5 people lost parents in the upper school. So there was just these 5 people, and other people began to think, what if my parents had gone to the World Trade Center? And we didn't have any access to media in the school except for the radio, so we couldn't see what was going on television. And when I went back up to my math class, and we turned on the radio, and it was all these garbled accounts of what was going on, and nothing was quite correct. And so there were all these other accounts that said like 5 more planes are in the air, or more planes are in the air, or suspected, and all the news, a lot of the news broadcasting systems were getting it wrong. So everyone in my grade thought that like there was going to be some sort of nuclear attack against New York, and people just started going nuts. And I remember looking out in the hallway, and there were all these kids frantically running around trying to find the bomb shelter, which had been in the school during the 50s, and during the Cold War, and I remember just people. It was like we'd lost every fragment of sanity, and that the structure that my educational life and the life in my school had just been wiped away. And the teachers tried to do whatever they could to calm us down, but it was so strange, because I remember some of the teachers were crying, and it was unlike I'd never remembered anything, like when the teachers had acted like that, and they were sort of the symbol of control over the students, and they were like the higher power. And the fact that they weren't completely sane themselves, or they weren't like their entire self, was really made everything worse, because there was no one we could look up to for advice. There was no one we could ask what's going on, and they just give us a clear and exact interpretation. And so it just added to the situation. And we went up to science class, and then everyone started thinking about, who could it be, what's going on. And I remember people just started spitting out names, and then one of those names came up, and someone said Bin Laden, and no one had any idea who he was. And he said, I don't know how that name came to me. It just came to my head, and I don't even know who it is. And everyone looked at him, and then we just kept on going with the day. And I remember at around 11:20, school got out, and everyone was really scared because they were afraid that their parents wouldn't be there to pick them up. And we went down to the the head of the upper school, and we were calling our parents to try and see if they were there. And I remember I couldn't get a hold of my parents because I tried them at home, and all cell phones had been shut off, and the lines were always busy, so I started to get really scared. And then I remember seeing that when we went down, it was there. We were waiting for everyone, and I just saw my dad, and it was like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. It was, I had never felt that kind of, I had never been that scared my entire life. And, during that day, I was only scared to a certain point. I wasn't scared that if something had happened and I was going to die. I wasn't scared of me dying. I was scared of my parents dying. Like, it's strange. After September 11th, I feel that if I was in an area where it was attacked or something, someone put nerve gas in a subway train, and I was about to die, I'm not scared of that. It isn't something I'm afraid of. Like, I feel whenever anything's going to happen, I'm prepared for it. But it was just, I was afraid for my parents, and I remember I saw my dad, and he said my mother was okay, and I was just, whew. And I remember we were trying. There were a lot of kids who couldn't get home because the subway stops, the subways weren't running. And my best friend, who lives in the Bronx, he couldn't get home. So I remember him. He went home with us, and so we started walking down the street, and most of the streets were blocked, and so cars couldn't go through, and there were just these people covered in dust with gas masks on their faces, just walking up, and I don't know, it seemed like something out of some sort of horrible nuclear apocalyptic science fiction movie, and we had no clue what was going on, and it was one of the most horrifying images I can remember. It was the worst day of my entire life, and we were walking, and I remember whenever we heard a plane overhead, we'd always duck and get into a corner, because we didn't know if it was something else, and we still weren't quite sure what was going on. And we finally got to my house, which is on 116 Prince Street, on the 4th floor. We tried. My mom still wasn't home, and I was kind of worried about her. And whenever a plane would go overhead, we'd duck down because we were afraid something else would happen. And I remember we were trying to do whatever we could to occupy ourselves to stop thinking about what was going on. And then for a while we just turned on the news, and we just saw the images of earlier just that day of the burning towers, and then both of them still hadn't quite fallen down, and we still hadn't had lunch. I remember there was a way for my friend to get home, and so we walked out, and my mom had finally come home, and he knew that his parents were okay because they don't work in the World Trade Center, and we walked up over to Broadway, and I looked down, and then my dad said he was going down to volunteer to try and help, and he'd left about 30 minutes earlier, and we were walking up, and then we walked over to, I think it was 4th Avenue. No, it was 4th Avenue or 5th Avenue, I don't remember, and we could see one of the buildings falling down, and I just got so scared because I thought my father had died, and it was just really horrifying. And so we went over to my mom's apartment, which is on 10th Street, and I was trying to get a hold of him countlessly. I was calling home. I was calling whoever I could to try and find out if he was okay. And we went home after that, and I sat home for like 2 hours trying to wonder if he was okay. And I had so many thoughts rushing through my head. And I was just thinking back during the day of when I remember some of my friends were just sitting on the top of the 6th floor in the greenhouse, just crying uncontrollably. Or those images on the television set I'd seen of the towers falling. And I didn't know if he was alive or dead or what was going to happen. And I remember, like, around 7 o'clock, he finally came home, and we asked what happened. And but before that, we had tried to get when we went to my mom's apartment. We tried to get back down. They wouldn't let us past Houston Street because it was blocked off. And so we were wondering and we couldn't get through, so we had to sneak around the policeman. And it was when I was getting really worried about my dad, and so I was like, I have to get through, and the policeman wouldn't let us through. So and I remember all the way up and down Houston Street, there were like SWAT team cars and army vehicles, and what we finally did was we snuck past a bunch of trucks, and that night around 7 o'clock my dad came up, and it was just like I felt relieved but still horrified at what had happened that day. And I remember when I went to sleep, I wasn't afraid of something else, if something else was going to happen. I was just afraid that more people would die, or what was going to happen the next day. And I remember the next day when we crossed 14th Street, we went to get a paper, and there were no papers. And we looked all around. We finally got a hold of an old mangy paper in the garbage can, and we were looking through in Au Bon Pain near Union Square, and it was just seeing the images of the people jumping out of the building on the newspaper was truly horrifying. And ever since that day, whenever I see a plane, I still just feel this shudder. And I remember all my friends sort of experienced the same thing, and it brought us all together. But it was just such a horrifying experience. It's like whenever I think back of this year, I can't think of anything except September 11th. It's like the overwhelming power of that day has just pushed all the other memories of my 8th grade graduating year aside, and I don't even remember what I've done with my friends. I remember on the last couple days, we were all wondering what we had done the year because we couldn't remember anything. And when the school was never the same because a lot of people had lost their families and they just were not themselves, and it was horrible. And I remember from that day on, whenever several weeks ago, I was walking home with one of my friends and we saw this plane swoop down, and it obviously just had to move because of an air blast or something, and it was swooping down. We got the illusion that it was about to hit a building, and so I remember everyone else was walking upwards up Broadway, and we saw this plane. We thought it was going to hit. It was just some trick of the mind, and just because of that day, we got the impression that the plane was going to hit the building, and so it was just like I revisited that whole day in those 15 seconds, and then the plane lifted up and nothing happened, and the rest of the day we wondered if anything happened, and of course nothing had, and it was just like a hallucination of some sort. And now, when I think back I think there's a lesson to be learned from what has happened. There are obviously dire situations, and in my mind, the fact that someone would do something like this is truly horrible, and that it's obviously it was a truly evil thing which was done, but of course, we ourselves have to think of ways to better ourselves to stop things like this ever happening again. And that's my story from September 11th. Thank you.